Today we're going to talk about Amos chapter 5, a text which both structurally and thematically stands at the very heart of the book of Amos. It is a text addressed to a puzzled audience because it contains some unusual ideas. Well, not as unusual as realizing you've erased yourself from existence without realizing it, as our friend Shrek here does, but pretty close. The text I want to focus on is found in chapter 5 verses 1 to 17, and it's a passage with a very interesting structure. The structure is concentric, and as you can see here, that means it consists of a number of smaller paragraphs that correspond to each other. So the first and the last of these sections talk about death, lamentation, mourning, funerals. The second and the sixth section both contain a call expressed with the same words, seek and live. Here in verses 4 to 6, the call is seek me, or seek the Lord and live. And in verses 14 and 15 it is seek good and not evil, that you may live. The innermost circle revolves around the theme of justice. Now in verse 7 the audience is reproached that they turn justice into poison, and in verses 10 to 12 there is a similar reproach. And then the innermost passage, the core of the concentric structure, the passage which has no counterpart, is a hymn that describes the creative power of the Lord, and it contains this phrase, Yahweh, the Lord is his name. Another way of looking at the structure is to think of the inner frame as describing the sin of Israel, which is injustice and oppression, to think of the outer frame as talking about the judgment which results from that sin. Here you have a call to repentance, and then at the heart of it all is a hymn describing the power and the person of God. Let's have a look now at the details of the text. The first and the last section talk about death, which is clearly an expression of the Lord's judgment. The opening words, hear this word that I take up over you in lamentation, O house of Israel, is an interesting one, because the lamentation is a funeral song, and it introduces the theme of death here. Amos is lamenting his audience as if they are already dead. Judgment comes in the form of a military defeat, which then results in a total decimation of the population. Only 1/10 of the army survives, and obviously this is not meant to be taken as a precise number. It simply expresses the extreme nature of the disaster. And just pay attention how this is conveyed in a number of different ways. The repetition of the word all in all squares, all streets, all vineyards creates a sense of the magnitude of the calamity, and the same effect is achieved by the mention of a number of different places, squares, streets, vineyards. In other words, everywhere. There is not a single spot which is shielded from this mourning. And the extremity of the situation is also conveyed by the fact that not only those who normally participate in lamentations, but even farmers who are supposed to be working the fields will be called to mourning. Everyone, everywhere weeps. The second set of passages contain Amos's call to his audience. It is expressed with the word seek, which is repeated 4 times in the passage. Twice with the meaning seek the Lord or seek me. Once do not seek. And then finally you have the command seek good and not evil. So the question, of course, is what does it mean to seek the Lord? In the Old Testament, the word is used in 2 different ways. One is to go to a sanctuary, and secondly to seek an oracle from a prophet. So initially Amos's audience would have probably thought of one of those 2 things. And this is why Amos proceeds defining for them what does it actually mean to seek the Lord. To seek the Lord does not mean to go to the sanctuaries of Bethel, Gilgal, or Beersheba. Now these were important sanctuaries in Israel. In northern Israel, Bethel was the place where Jacob had his dream, and it was then made by Jeroboam I into one of the national worship centers of the northern kingdom. Gilgal was associated with Joshua, the crossing of the Jordan, and the conquest of the land. And Beersheba was connected with traditions about Abraham. So why should they not go to these places? Why seeking the Lord means, why seeking the Lord means not going to Bethel and Gilgal and Beersheba? People have different ideas why Amos is criticizing the worship in these places. In other words, different ideas what was wrong with the sanctuary in Bethel, for example. Some think the problem is that Bethel is not Jerusalem. In other words, Amos was criticizing the Israelites for their worship in these places because he or the editors of his book thought that the Lord has to be worshipped only in Jerusalem. However, Jerusalem is not a major concern in the book of Amos. It's mentioned once in the beginning and not a lot after that. So you have to read that idea into the text. Others think that the problem with these places were that they were places where either the Lord was not worshipped correctly or other gods were worshipped alongside him. Bethel, for example, was the place where the golden calf was, and Amos may have been criticizing the Israelites because of their impure worship. However, just like Jerusalem, the question about idolatry is not really central to the book of Amos. It's mentioned once or twice in passing, but Amos, unlike Hosea, never mentions, for example, the golden calf. And so idolatry does not seem to be the main concern here. Actually, the text says quite clearly what is wrong with the worship in those places. To seek the Lord and live is synonymous to seeking good and not evil. And to seek good and not evil means hating evil and loving good. In other words, a passion to establish justice in the gate. And so Amos seems to be criticizing his audience and their worship, not because it was necessarily idolatrous or incorrect, but because it was practiced by people who were engaged with oppression, injustice. And so to go back to my initial point, when Amos uses the word to seek, he seems to be defining it in a new way and investing it with a new meaning. To seek the Lord does not mean to go to a sanctuary. It does not mean to consult a prophet. It means to practice justice. And this is confirmed by the third set of paired passages, the inner frame of the concentric structure of this passage, verses 7 and then verses 10 to 12, which talk about the sin of Amos's audience. And that sin revolves around the issues of justice, righteousness, and oppression. These people prevent the normal functioning of justice. They hate the one who reproves at the gate and speaks the truth, and they trample on the poor and impose upon them unbearable burdens. And this is all done to finance a life of ease and luxury. These people pervert justice because they want to be able to build houses of hewn stones, they want to plant pleasant vineyards, they want to live in comfort and ease. And for that reason they deny justice to the needy, they promote corruption, and they afflict the righteous. It is the same situation we encountered in chapter 2. The problem is not worship itself. It is not the altars or the house of their God. The problem is the fact that worship coexists with injustice. The people who worship oppress, and their worship does not challenge in any way their life of oppression. So the problem with Israel's worship is not the rituals they follow, nor the name of the God they use. These, as far as Amos is concerned, are okay. The Israelites worship Yahweh, but their worship does not translate itself into a life of righteousness and mercy. They use and abuse other people to enrich themselves and to be able to live the lives of luxury and ease which they want. And they thought this was okay. Have a look at this interesting detail in verse 14 here. Amos says, seek good and not evil, and so the Lord, the God of hosts, will be with you just as you claim. In other words, they believed that God was with them. They could see no link between their worship and their business activities and their social involvement. The idea that God was unhappy with them simply because they liked a little bit of extra cash at the expense of other people must have been a very strange and confusing one.